In an increasingly interdependent world, global shocks similar to the pandemic will be far more likely. For example, the world currently faces growing crises in climate and nature. This year, countries across Europe and around the world have also felt the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so it is vital that we use what we have learned from the pandemic in dealing with these and other emergencies.
I don't think anybody expected there to be a pandemic, but one was inevitable. I think the issue now going forward as we emerge from the pandemic we've had is how are we better prepared for the shock to the system, and that applies to any global shock. That's what I hope we are able to discuss in a non-judgmental fashion and learn some lessons that will be useful to every citizen and to all of society, and not just in Scotland.
So when I look back, I see enormous scientific discovery. I see resilience in families, in businesses, in children and adults, and I've met a host of people who have gone that extra mile to both care and treat and look after our population.
I don't think you could overestimate just how traumatic the pandemic has been for people in care homes and their relatives. I think there was an assumption that once people are in a care home, that their husbands, their wives, their daughters, their mothers, it's just not as important, but we were more important than any carer.
In social care, responding to the pandemic was like racing the tides up the sand. But instead of wet or dry feet, you were racing for life or death. So what's needed of us now is to rebuild from scratch, not build and repair. We need a new system, a system that's based on the plurality of responses that people need, not what the establishment thinks they should get.
Economic shocks, including the recent COVID-19 pandemic, typically widen inequalities, and we're seeing that once again with the cost of living crisis. So how to build resilience into our economy must be a priority in the years ahead. Likely reforms will come from many avenues, whether it be in the safety net provided during troubled times or tackling the root causes of inequalities from the outset.
You've got to be ready to prepare for, if you like, unknown unknowns. And I think the pandemic has taught us a lot of lessons about resilience and how to cope with these shocks.
We need to learn the lessons clearly from what we've done up until now and prepare and be more resilient as a country as we look ahead to the shocks that will come. We won't know from where, but they will come.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad to welcome the people who are taking part in this now online who have joined us. As I said, we have three contributors from this evening, and then a contribution from Sally Witcher, which will come online. But let me start with the first of those contributors, Adam Tompkins, who can't be here but has recorded his contribution. Adam has been John Miller Professor of Public Law in Glasgow University since 2003. He is an authority on the British constitutional law. He's been a legal advisor to the House of Lords Constitution Committee. He was a member of the Smith Commission in 2014. In 2015, he was a constitutional advisor to the Secretary of State for Scotland. He became an MSP for the Glasgow region in 2016, sat in the Scottish Parliament until 2021. He served on the Finance and Constitution Committee, Social Security, and the COVID-19 Committee, which was a committee set up to scrutinise the government's response to COVID-19 before being convener of the Justice Committee. He is now a senior fellow at Policy Exchange and a columnist in the Herald, and he's lectured in a wide variety of countries. Adam and I were political opponents, but we worked together during the pandemic, but from different perspectives, with my own responsibility at that time largely being for regulation and legislation, and Adam being a very effective scrutineer of those processes. And I'm very interested to see what Adam has reflected on those experiences. We have Adam online, so let's hear it from him.
Hello there. My name is Adam Tompkins, and I'm the John Miller Professor of Public Law in the University of Glasgow. And for 5 years, from 2016 to 2021, I was an MSP in the Scottish Parliament. And I've been asked to share with you some reflections on constitutional government, human rights, the separation of powers, and the pandemic, and the way in which Parliament and government, and indeed the law, reacted during the time of the pandemic here in Scotland. In one of the spycatcher cases some 35 years ago, when Margaret Thatcher's government was chasing Peter Wright through the world's courts, seeking to suppress his memoir of time served in MI5, Lord Bridge said in the House of Lords that freedom of speech is always the first casualty of a totalitarian regime. It is equally clear that the separation of powers is the first casualty of an emergency regime. This is, sad to say, a long-established pattern. An emergency occurs. There is fear and no little panic. Parliament meets to confer huge powers on government ministers, powers that would be unthinkable in peacetime, but which are deemed necessary to meet the new demands of the emergency. Ministers get all too used to exercising such powers and do not wish to let them go, not even after the emergency which triggered them has started to subside. Yet, when their exercise is challenged in court, the judges do not want to know. Judging what is necessary in time of emergency, they say, is for the executive, not for the courts. Thus, emergencies empower governments at the expense of both Parliament and the judiciary. This is no illicit power grab, rather it's the willing transfer of power from legislature to government, in which parliamentarians are entirely complicit, just as it is the fully conscious desire and decision of the judiciary not to subject the exercise of emergency powers to meaningful or robust scrutiny. This is what happened in both the First and the Second World Wars, when Parliament empowered ministers indefinitely to detain foreign nationals without the need for any criminal charge to be brought, never mind a criminal trial. And when the courts meekly looked the other way and kept the incarcerated behind bars without anyone having to show that their ongoing detention was necessary in the national interest. And it's what happened again in the so-called war on terror after 9/11, when Tony Blair's government created ever more imaginative regimes to subject suspected terrorists to coercive legal controls without charging them with or trying them for any criminal offense. But it's not just in wartime or in the face of perceived terrorist threat that governments overreach in this way. Public health emergencies too follow the same pattern. Parliament confers sweeping powers on ministers, and any hope of checking their subsequent misuse is rendered hopeless by a judiciary that does not want to know. Such was the story not only in Scotland, but throughout the United Kingdom in 2020 to 2022, during the 2-year COVID pandemic. Such indeed was the story right around the world, from New Zealand to Canada, from Ireland to the United States. Why does it matter? Why should we care about the separation of powers or about its breach in the face of public emergency? I mean, it's not as if mass protests assemble on Britain's streets under the banner of the separation of powers, is it? It's no one's rallying cry, no one's flag, no one's cause. Yet worry about it we should. To its founders, the idea of the separation of powers could not have been more important. It is the separation of powers that keeps us free, they claimed. For Montesquieu, in the 18th century in France and for James Madison in revolutionary America. It was indeed the single most important tool we had to safeguard us from tyranny. That's a great 18th century word, tyranny. What it means is the accumulation of too much power in too few hands. What it means is power without responsibility, power without accountability. It's what you get if you don't keep powers separate. And it's what we had in those years of emergency pandemic rule, from the spring of 2020 to the spring of 2022. We had, in short, what Madison would have regarded as tyranny, too much power in too few hands. Now, I do not mean this as a criticism. After all, I voted for it. And if I am ever again confronted with the circumstances which faced me as an MSP in March 2020, I would vote for it again. I was one of those parliamentarians who was, to use the word I used earlier, complicit in transferring more powers to government ministers, ministers whom it was my job to oppose, than has ever before occurred in the United Kingdom in peacetime. We conferred on them the power not only to lock up the sick, but to lock up the well, or at least the power to lock down everything the well would otherwise have been entitled to. For months, it was a criminal offence to leave your home without lawful excuse. If, as I did, you lived in Glasgow, you could not legally walk up a hill. You could not legally go for a run on the beach. To do so would have posed no health risk to anyone, but you still couldn't do it. Worse, you might find that you could not hold the hand of a dying relative. You might find that you could not even attend their funeral. We need to look ourselves full in the face here and admit that some of the things we voted for, some of the things we did, were barbaric, utterly inhumane. But we knew what we were doing, and as I've just said, be in no doubt, if we ever have to do it again, we will. That we knew what we were doing helped. Yes, as parliamentarians, we conferred huge powers on ministers, but at the same time, we did impose some limits. Emergency powers would lapse after a certain period of time. They could be renewed, but there were nonetheless time constraints. Likewise, the law we made insisted that emergency powers could be used only when ministers considered it necessary and proportionate. In practice, though, this constraint had little bite. When a minister asserts that it is necessary in the name of public health to keep pubs closed, or to keep nightclubs shut, or to prevent people from traveling more than a few kilometers from their homes, it is mighty difficult for even the best equipped opposition MSP or MP to challenge that ministerial assertion of necessity. And that's because the evidence, such as it is, which supports the risk assessment leading to the conclusion that we must keep the pubs shut, or whatever it was, is evidence from government scientists who report to government ministers. Controlling the information flow is one of ministers' most powerful tools, and it renders effective parliamentary scrutiny nigh on impossible. Holyrood did its best. It did well, for example, to set up a dedicated COVID-19 committee whose job it was to scrutinize government decisions about what was necessary to combat and to meet the risks associated with the pandemic. I was a member of that committee for some months, but truth be told, I do not remember the committee ever being able to change a minister's mind about what measures were needed and what were not as the pandemic unfolded through the long months of 2020 and 2021. I recall a particular exchange between the committee and the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, about why certain restrictive measures continued, in his view, to be necessary because there was a higher R number in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. The R number, you may remember, was the rate at which the virus was able to spread. Yet, when the committee tried to understand how the R number had been calculated, or how those calculations had led to the result that the virus was apparently still more dangerous in Scotland than it was elsewhere in the UK, the committee failed entirely. The committee was an environment in which ministers had to explain what they were doing and not doing, but it was useless as a means of getting under the skin of why they were doing this or not doing that. Again, this is to cast no aspersions either on ministers or on my former parliamentary colleagues. They did their best. It's simply to point out the inevitable, inescapable limitations to the parliamentary process when it comes to scrutinizing what ministers deem to be necessary in order to manage risk in a time of emergency. The one exception, and this will be my final point in these remarks today, was in the context of rights. Human rights, if they mean anything at all, trump policy preferences. To say that something is a right is to say that even if we would prefer as a matter of policy to act contrary to that thing, to that right, we may not do so because the right is simply more important. On 2 occasions, we were able, as a parliament, to stop ministers from doing things that they would quite like to have done because we could identify rights that stood in their way. The first was the right to get married, and the second was the right to trial by jury. Ministers were worried that weddings, at which large numbers of people could come together to celebrate, would allow the virus to spread. That was perfectly understandable, but it did not mean to say that we had to stop people from getting married at all. A lawful marriage ceremony in Scotland requires only 5 people, the hopefully happy couple, a celebrant, and 2 witnesses. Even in time of COVID, Scotland has numerous venues at which 5 people could safely gathered, socially distanced and masked though they might be, to get married. When it was pointed out that the right to marry is protected in the European Convention on Human Rights, ministers conceded that even if large wedding parties needed to be curtailed, marriage itself need not be. Likewise, the right to trial by jury. That's not a convention right under European law, but an ancient right of our own domestic law. In England, it can be traced all the way back to Magna Carta, and here in Scotland, it is likewise fundamental to our traditions, so fundamental that it is a basic right. And like the right to marry, it proved to be one which even the pandemic could not displace. From these remarks, I would draw 4 conclusions. First, that the story of the pandemic in Scotland followed a very familiar constitutional pattern. Second, that even though Holyrood did its best, it nonetheless found it extraordinarily difficult to hold ministers to account for the exercise of the emergency powers Parliament had conferred upon them. Third, that for this reason, the single most important thing for any Parliament to remember is to insist that emergency powers must lapse after a certain period of time, even if ministers don't want to let them go. And finally, even in a time of public emergency, perhaps especially in a time of public emergency, rights matter. They matter in court, for sure, but they also matter in Parliament. And ultimately, the only times we were able to change ministerial minds was when we could show that what they wanted to do would be contrary to rights. Arguments that measures were unnecessary or disproportionate never worked. Ministers could always rely on the flow of data and information to counter and to resist such arguments. But rights really can be trumps, even in an emergency. And for that reason, we must always hold on to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you, thank Adam for recording that very thoughtful and well experienced reflection on what took place, and we can discuss that and talk about it as we come to that session today. I'd now like to ask Professor Peter Jackson, who's the Chair in Global Security at the University of Glasgow and Executive Director of the Scottish Council of Global Affairs, to speak. And of course, as I said earlier, Scottish Council of Global Affairs, is a partner of ours in these events. Peter received his PhD in history from the University of Cambridge in 1995 before taking up a postdoctorate fellowship at Yale. He's taught at the University of Cambridge, Yale, Aberystwyth and Strathclyde, and been visiting professor at Université de Paris. Peter's areas of specialization include the international history of the 19th and 20th centuries. He took up the chair in global security at the University of Glasgow in 2013, where his research projects have included the practice of international history in the 21st century and the weight of the past in Franco-British relations since 1815. The weight of the past is also felt in Scotland, of course, as well. Peter was editor of Intelligence and National Security, the world's leading journal in the field of intelligence studies and security issues, for 12 years. And he's a fellow of both the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Royal Historical Society. And thank you, Peter, for agreeing to contribute today.
Thanks very much, Michael. Thanks for that very thorough introduction. Thanks also to the organizers, including yourself, for the invitation to speak, and also for the opportunity for the Scottish Council on Global Affairs to be part of this important and very worthwhile initiative to think about future global shocks. And I want to talk to you today about how some of the civil liberties issues raised by the pandemic played out in a context quite a long way removed from Scotland, and that is Canada, where you can, I think, hear from my accent that I'm not of this parish. I am actually Canadian. In fact, I'm from a province of Alberta, which is where some of the most intense opposition to the Canadian government's policies, especially toward public health restrictions, was concentrated. Many of them, in fact, many of the leading voices were old friends of mine and Facebook friends. So this is an interesting attempt for me to reflect on I suppose, the global dimension, but also to begin with the observation that the pandemic was both a global and a profoundly local and even personal experience for most of us. It underlined the extent to which events taking place in areas well removed from our own locale were of profound importance to us. It also, in very interesting ways, and in the ways I'll explore in Canada, generated protests in defense of civil liberties that in some cases, and in this case in particular, mapped on to transnational networks of opposition to liberal democracy, or certainly liberal technocracy, on both the right and the left. And in particular, the politics of the pandemic, the civil rights dimensions of the pandemic played out in interesting ways in a confrontation between discontented elements concentrated in Alberta, but with nationwide support on the one hand, and the Canadian government and its public health measures and restrictions on the other. It was an event, and I'm talking here about the Freedom Convoy, the Truckers' Freedom Convoy that traveled across Canada. It's a long journey across Canada if you're in a truckers' convoy, to descend on Ottawa in the first instance and the Ambassador Bridge between Windsor, Ontario and Detroit in the United States on the other. This was sparked by vaccine mandates and other public health measures instituted, very interestingly, mainly by the Canadian provinces and not by the federal government. It was within the context of the fourth, the Delta wave, and the fifth, the Omicron wave of the COVID-19 global pandemic. And within the context of the fact that 13% approximately of Canadian adults were actually unvaccinated, and yet by the height of the Omicron wave, 60% of hospitalizations in Canada were of the unvaccinated. So, in other words, there certainly was a rationale, as we've just heard from Adam Tompkins, for some of these measures, however restrictive they are and were and may continue to be of civil liberties, because the Ontario Chief Health Officer is now talking about reinstituting mask mandates again in Ontario, and the whole debate's winding up again. Very, very interesting. So at the moment, the public had been living with various levels of restrictions for nearly 2 years by late January 2022 when this kicked off. And the measures, including vaccine mandates, as I mentioned before, were mainly the responsibility of Canadian provinces. Something to remember that every Canadian province has more legislative authority than any devolved administration in the United Kingdom. And something that this is quite often forgotten, that in fact provinces are hugely important in any national debate in Canada. The mandate requiring essential workers, however, is a mandate passed in November 2021 and implemented on the 15th of January 2022 was a federal mandate. And it was about in particular, the right of people to go across the Canadian border without having been vaccinated. And this sparked a large protest beginning in Alberta, but spreading across Canada. By the third week in July, it had become the focal point for what had been an online protest, which spread quickly into the real world, and especially focused in border crossing points between Canada and the United States. Also important, I think, to mention that the United States also had legislation preventing the unvaccinated from going across the border, including essential workers after November of 2021. What it did was it prevented unvaccinated truckers, in particular, from being able to ply their trade across the Canada-US border. It became a magnetic pole for opposition to public health measures in general, provincial or federal, and also opposition to the Trudeau government of Pierre Trudeau, the leader of the Liberal Party, and in general to federal politics. And it drew on deep wells of resentment, especially in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, over a widespread and historic sense that the government in Ottawa governed without any regard for the needs or the requirements, the wishes of populations in Western Canada. This is a very deep-seated sentiment. It goes back certainly to my youth, which is a long time ago, and a lot of it had to do with energy and the politics of energy, which we can talk about in questions if this is of interest to anyone. But it was intermingled with a powerful current of populist opposition to liberal, small L liberal politics in general on both sides of the border. And one of the key issues in public and official discourse about what to do about this protest movement, once it descended on Ottawa and once it closed the Ambassador Bridge between Detroit and Windsor, between Canada and the United States at Windsor, which is a main artery of Canada-US trade, the discourse centered around the extent to which this was American culture wars being imported into Canada, or whether something else was going on. And this is probably the focal point of what I have to say. Interestingly, to me anyhow, only between 12 and 14% of truckers were actually unvaccinated, but this was not the point. The rallying cry was opposition to state intrusion into the realm of private citizens' health choices and control over their bodies. But it was also fertile ground for long-standing opposition to the federal liberal government. And this is expressed particularly in the slogan, I'm not going to say the word, but FCK Trudeau, which one still sees all over rural Ontario, rural Alberta, everywhere in Canada. When we move out of the cities into the provinces, you see this logo still everywhere. And it was a rallying point for the Freedom Convoy as it moved across Canada. I was able to track it through Facebook friends in particular and to get a sense of their enthusiasm, but also, I suppose, from my own perspective, it raised my blood pressure at times. to focus on Parliament Hill in Ottawa and the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor and Detroit on the 29th of January 2022. And it shut down the Canadian capital for the better part of 2 weeks, for more than 2 weeks, in fact, because these truckers parked their cars in main thoroughfares, including all routes leading to Parliament Hill, and basically brought much public life in Ottawa, which is a government town, to a standstill. The initial response of the federal government was patience. The provincial government and the city of Ottawa were much less patient, and in fact, the provincial government of Ontario declared a state of emergency very early on in this crisis. But it generated an interesting national debate in terms of both public sphere and official discourse, which is deeply divided. The political parties were divided. The Conservative Party, on the one hand, tried to use the protest as a way to criticize the Trudeau government. There's no question about that. And in a way fell into the trap, or moved towards falling into the trap, of trying to incorporate some of the far-right discontent within the movement into their own, to benefit their own political momentum, because it was absolutely clear there were racist elements to this. There were ties to international far-right movements, no question. There was also something approaching sedition in terms of the leaders of the convoy calling for the removal of the Trudeau government. It would obviously be an illegal movement. And so the Conservatives tended as a party, the Progressive Conservative, I think they're only called the Conservatives now. They've abandoned all pretense to progressive politics, I guess. But they argued that this movement needed to be taken seriously as a kind of an indigenous political force, whereas there was a tendency within the Liberal Party and the New Democratic Party, the parties to the centre left and left in Canada, to characterize the movement as basically being a result of foreign influence and funded by foreign donors through crowdfunding sites like GoFundMe and Fund Send Go, I think it was called, something like this, because these platforms were open to foreign donations as well. Within officialdom, this division was also there. Jody Thomas, the National Security Advisor, argued that the truckers' convoy in Ottawa and on the Ambassador Bridge down on the Canada-US border were clear and present threats to public order in Canada, and argued, therefore, for the invocation of the Emergencies Act, the Canadian Emergencies Act, which was, in fact, on the 14th of February, invoked for the first time since it had been passed in 1988. Meanwhile, interestingly, the director of Canada's intelligence community, a man named David Vigneault, who was the director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, argued that this was an overreaction, that it would in fact only add credibility and momentum to the movement, and he argued instead to sit and wait them out. So there was a division within Canada as well. Vigneault, the director of CSIS, lost the argument, and the Emergency Act was invoked. Before it could be put into place, however, most of the protesters in Ottawa and especially on the Ambassador Bridge had been cleared, but there were quite intrusive measures, including freezing bank accounts of the most prominent leaders of the protest, and also invoking legislation preventing platforms like GoFundMe and especially GoFund Send Go or something, whatever it was called, which is an American platform, to prevent them from transferring payments into Canada. And Canadian banks were forbidden from processing these transactions. So we're into territory, especially with the National Emergencies Act, where this is quite a heavy-handed response in many ways. And there is now an inquiry in Ottawa, public inquiry, federal government inquiry into whether this move was genuine. And some very interesting things are coming up. The Canadian security establishment is one of the most closed in the world. But in this case, for the first time in recent memory, really interesting testimony is taking place on the advice given to government by the intelligence services and by the National Security Advisor. So big questions remain. The Freedom Convoy remains very popular across Canada still, and in fact has, I suppose, repositioned itself and done a bit of revisionist history. And its front page now reads, and I'll quote to you from it from here, the Freedom Convoy Facebook page, "Our vision is to advocate, educate, participate in awareness campaigns to restore and preserve Canadians' constitutional right to be free from government overreach," a word we heard in Adam Tompkins' presentation as well. "Our mission is to successfully hold the government accountable to the rule of law and end all mandates. We stand together with our countrymen impacted by these illegal policies and fight for justice, reckoning, and restitution." So they're positioning themselves, the leaders of this movement now, very much as a mainstream movement to protect civil liberties. And of course, in a way, I suppose also providing grist to the mill for critics of the Trudeau government for the decisions it took in February of 2022. Now, was this movement really an example of American culture wars spilling across the border into Canada? The evidence we have so far, much of it is coming out in this inquiry, is driving home a few uncomfortable truths. In fact, this content seems very much to have been homegrown, and its support came overwhelmingly. That word is used too much in politics, but in this case, it's true, overwhelmingly from Indigenous sources. 88% of the $10 million Canadian donated to the Freedom Convoy originated in Canada, and 86% of donors were actually Canadian. The Go Send Go platform was, I think, the total in less than $1 million donations, less than $1 million, and it was predominantly American. And so what this does, I think, is it causes us to think carefully about a tendency we have to try and marginalize or delegitimize protests, local protests, by pretending that these populist currents aren't really Canadian. In fact, anyone who grew up in Alberta could say, no, these are Canadian, these are very much Canadian. But it's also, and I think, a lesson, to me anyhow, I was reading a while back a book by Jan Werner Müller on populism. And he talks about one particularly fertile area of politics for populist rhetoric, and that is the tendency of large modern states to be governed by technocrats, liberal technocrats in particular, who can easily be presented as being remote, unresponsive, unaccountable to the needs of the public. And an example of how modern government is out of touch and has lost the connections with the tradition of public sovereignty, popular sovereignty, which is supposedly the taproot of democracy in general. So the pandemic really shines a light on some of these dilemmas. And I think some of them were here as well in the United Kingdom in terms of protest. This need to balance, on the one hand, public health concerns and the need to protect the many by, in fact, imposing swinging restrictions on even greater number. So, I suppose in a way, the pandemic was a classic example of the liberal technocracy imposing its vision on the public and providing populist movements, I think, with very fertile ground to promote their politics of grievance and the argument that governments have lost touch with the people. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, and that's a very useful and very comprehensive view of something that was taking place just off to one side from what Scotland was focusing on at that time. But thank you, and I'm sure we'll return to some of those issues. Can I now ask Dr. Catherine Nash to contribute a different contribution? We're getting a lot of perspectives in here, and we'll have finally one from Sally Witcher in a moment. Catherine is a postdoctoral research fellow with the Political Settlements Research Programme. She completed her PhD at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Catherine's research focuses on norms, the role of regions in the international community, and peace and security issues. Prior to beginning her PhD, Catherine worked for the US Department of State, first in the Bureau of African Affairs and Office of the Special Envoy to Sudan, and then in the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. She has a master's degree in conflict resolution from Georgetown University and a bachelor's degree from the George Washington University in international relations. Catherine's publications include African Peace, Regional Norms from the Organization of African Unity to the African Union in 2021, which examines the role of African regional organizations in constructive collective conflict management rules for the continent. And Catherine's focus in her contribution will at least start with Africa and the work of those organizations.
Thank you so much. Can folks hear me? Okay. Sorry, I tend to speak quite softly. I've been told on more than one occasion to put on a mic. So thank you again for having me. And shifting kind of from the state focus, I'll be speaking more about the intergovernmental level. And I think some interesting threads have been brought up about kind of the role of consent by populations. I'll be speaking kind of mostly more about the positive contributions of the African Union and the African Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or Africa CDC. But I think there are questions that continue to be raised about kind of the role of these organizations and how they answer to populations in their member states. So throughout the pandemic period, my work, which was supported by the COVID Collective, focused on responses by regional organizations across the globe. And working with a team of researchers, we mapped political and public health responses by organizations in the Americas, Africa, the Middle East, and South and Southeast Asia. And today, as I mentioned, I'll be focusing on the African region. So at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, there was concern about particular vulnerabilities of the African continent in the face of the pandemic. And the AU Africa CDC Joint Continental Strategy for COVID-19 highlighted that Africa's baseline vulnerability could be quite high, with inadequate health and hygiene systems, increasing travel, and other ongoing health and social crises. The continent as a whole tended to do better in the earlier phases of the pandemic. There's a lot of debate now about why that was, and with various waves there were different responses, as well as continuing challenges with access to vaccines. But I'll be speaking mostly about the responses and some of, I think, the potential impact around global governance. So acting on this concern, the AU and the Africa CDC really tried to act very early on, so early 2020. And the breadth and scope of this response was particularly notable given that the Africa CDC, which was the specialized health institute of the African Union, but is now an autonomous health body, was only created in January 2016 and was launched about a year later in 2017. And it had to really quickly build up its capacity to respond, build up its institutions, build up regional centers across the continent, and really did so quite quickly. So the foundational document of the regional response to COVID-19 is the Joint Continental Strategy. And it was released in early 2020. It was jointly between the African Union and the Africa CDC, and it sets out the primary objectives of ensuring a coordinated response and promoting evidence-based practices to prevent, treat, and control COVID-19. And from a public health perspective, it focused on 6 areas. So surveillance, infection prevention and control, clinical support, laboratory diagnoses, communications, and medical supply procurement. There was a later strategy that was adapted, and it was released in June 2021. The objectives were the same, but it acknowledged some of the wider harms of the pandemic and really sought to have enhanced prevention, monitoring, treatment to contain COVID-19 while minimizing these other harms. So the kind of public health response that the Africa CDC helped to stand up has a range of responses, and a lot of it involved direct support to member states. Examples include working in collaboration with the WHO or World Health Organization to do training of trainers events across member states to enhance surveillance at ports of entry. It partnered with nonprofit and corporate partners to deliver critical supplies. There was a lot of communications to produce materials for the general public and healthcare workers. There were initiatives to combat disinformation and work with journalists. And all of this is documented through a very good kind of exhaustive portal on the Africa CDC website that has had Africa CDC outbreak briefings pretty much every week since the start of the pandemic. There's a dashboard. There's a lot of policy and other examples of the public information campaign. So all of this is publicly available for folks who are more interested in the details of the response. But there was also, I think, a large response that focused on advocacy and initiatives to address longer term concerns and really inequality within the international system. So the AU and Africa CDC highlighted early on in the pandemic the issues with unequal access to medical supplies across the globe. The communique from the May 2020 AU Peace and Security Council expressed concern over the increase of unilateral approaches promoting isolationist and protectionist policies, which undermine the values of living in peace together by restricting access of developing countries to medical supplies. The AU used its power on the global stage to speak collectively for the continent, and then it took steps to try and address this practically. So creating the Africa Medical Supplies Platform, which used Africa's bulk purchasing power to secure supplies and stabilize prices. And interestingly, in terms of diplomacy and work between Africa and other regions, this platform was opened up to members of the Caribbean community to help expand access to medical supplies to other regions that might not have as much access. On vaccine access, the AU established the Africa Vaccine Acquisition Task Team in August 2020, which later became the African Vaccine Acquisition Trust. And this body sought to work to secure vaccines for African states, and this worked in addition to global initiatives like COVAX. And it's thus far been able to procure hundreds of millions of vaccines. In addition, there was kind of further partnering. So in June 2021, Africa CDC partnered with the MasterCard Foundation for a $1.5 billion program, saving lives and livelihoods. And this initiative is multifaceted, but includes not only purchasing vaccines, but developing better systems to deploy vaccines. This can include, for instance, if vaccines are close to their expiration date, surging support to get them out to communities that need them, supporting local vaccine manufacturing in Africa, and developing the healthcare workforce in Africa CDC's capacity. And further to developing the capacity to produce vaccines, the Partnerships for African Vaccine Manufacturing Framework was released in 2022 with the ambitious goal of enabling African vaccine manufacturing to develop, produce, and supply over 60% of the total vaccine doses required by the continent by 2040. And this would be up from 1% currently. There has already been action taken to achieve this goal. So after receiving the necessary number of treaty ratifications, the AU is moving ahead with establishing the Africa Medicines Agency, which will provide oversight of things like clinical trials. Rwanda will host the African Medicines Agency, along with the African Pharmaceutical Technology Institute. And Rwanda also recently broke ground on a BioNTech vaccine manufacturing facility. So all of these things are going beyond just the planning phase. They are kind of coming into fruition. And this is in addition to a lot of other initiatives. So for instance, standing up an AU COVID response fund to help with the humanitarian and economic side of things, advocating for debt relief so that member states could be able to adequately respond to the pandemic. So there's been a large contingent of not only public health, but also economic, social, global inequality advocacy that has happened by the African Union and Africa CDC in a kind of total package of responding to the pandemic. And I think kind of all of this brings into question kind of what will be the impact of this going forward, because we not only need to talk about the impact of the pandemic, but the impact of the responses to the pandemic, both potentially negatively in terms of trying to understand what boundaries should be, but also positively in terms of transforming potentially global governance. And my response or my work thus far is focused on mapping, but I think there's going to be a lot of impact on the global governance stage because of the increased capacity and advocacy of African intergovernmental organizations. And prior to the pandemic in 2019, Dr. John Nagasan, who would be the director of the Africa CDC for most of the pandemic, put forward a concept of a new public health order for Africa to address health security and inequalities across the continent. And the pandemic, I think, really supercharged the approach to this and brought about more of an initiative to make this concept real. And it's going to include things that I've mentioned, such as creating local capacity, increasing institutions, partnerships across the globe. And it's at its beginning phases of, I think, being truly implemented. But going forward, it'll be important to understand how this new public health order for Africa develops and what it means not only within Africa, but what it means for the role that the African continent will play going forward to address complex crises, both within the region and outside the region. And I'll look forward to discussion.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And the range of perspectives we're building up here is about positives and negatives. And before we finally move to questions and discussion, let me introduce Dr. Sally Witcher, who should be joining us online. I think we'll just wait a second for her to do so, and she'll come up on the screen. And there is Sally. Thank you very much. And she is with us, a miracle of modern technology. There's been a lot of waiting to see whether that would happen. Welcome, Sally. Dr. Sally Witcher currently works as a freelance consultant, having spent around 30 years working in the fields of equality and inclusion. Her previous roles include Chief Executive Officer of Inclusion Scotland and Director of the Child Poverty Action Group UK. She's also worked as a senior civil servant in the Office of Disability Issues, based in the UK Government Department of Work and Pensions, where she was charged with rolling out a disability equality strategy across government. Her academic experience includes a doctorate in diversity and social inclusion, a lecturer at Queen Margaret University College, being an advisory committee member of the LAC Centre for the Analysis of Social Exclusion for 10 years. Sally's public appointments span chair of the Scottish Commission on Social Security, chair of the UK Government's Disability Employment Advisory Committee, and a board member of the Care Inspectorate. And she has lived experience of inequality, which has been compounded by the need to shield since the pandemic broke, as she remains at high risk. So, Sally, we're very grateful to you for taking part in this. We look forward to hearing from you.
Batten down the hatches against the same storm. Whether we were rich or poor, whether or not at clinical or other risks we didn't fully yet understand, we all found ourselves imprisoned in our own homes, fearing for our own lives. Our rights to freedom of association, freedom of movement, among many other rights, were denied to us. But while in some respects lockdown was a great leveller, it may have been the same storm, but our boats were not the same. And that's the thing about equal treatment. Sometimes it's what's needed to promote equality, sometimes it exacerbates pre-existing inequalities. Nonetheless, for some people, there were elements of welcome to my world. Disabled people have long experienced barriers to inclusion, like negative attitudes, inaccessible buildings, transport and communications, and all of these curtail our freedoms. In fact, it's often those that disable us, not our impairments. Interestingly, when the majority found themselves briefly in our world, things previously branded impossible, like remote working, became possible. With widespread use of online technology, the boundaries between inclusion and exclusion were redrawn. And they're still being redrawn, sometimes back to where they were before. In some cases, with consequences so extreme that in my lifetime, I'm hard-pressed to think of examples of greater avoidable inequality and exclusion. And this doesn't just apply to disabled people. Because now something else is going on. As I see it, the pandemic did more than supercharge pre-existing inequalities. It, along with the responses to it, has reframed them. COVID caused a new societal fault line. It ripped a new tear in the societal fabric. It brought new drivers and manifestations of inequality and exclusion. It reframed inequality around risk of ill health, disability and death, and consequently the need for prevention. It revealed two types of risk to be mitigated, clinical and exposure. And barriers too were reframed. For example, inaccessible buildings now encompass those that aren't COVID safe. So I'd like to offer a view, briefly, from the far side of the social divide. On one side, it's all about recovery and learning lessons with the benefit of the distance of time that's passed. On the other, the pandemic is very much still here. So, just to start off, a few months ago, people such as me on the highest clinical risk list were told they were no longer at high clinical risk because of vaccines and antivirals. And this was at a time when mysteriously many of us had no access to Springfield boosters or antivirals. We knew vaccine protection wanes, and there was nothing to suggest our underlying clinical risk had in any way diminished. Meanwhile, the 500,000 people in the UK who are immunocompromised, whose bodies can't produce antibodies in response to vaccination, were targeted for boosters, while being denied the drug Evusheld that would give them the antibodies they lacked. That's a drug available in 32 countries, supported by over 125 clinicians across the UK from 17 specialisms. The only way these people can access it is to pay £1,000 a pop. That's the price of their freedom, and many can't afford it. So for people like us, so-called restrictions, like mask mandates, are protections, not restrictions. When they were lifted, the First Minister and Cabinet Secretary advised people to still consider wearing masks and urged them to remember to protect the vulnerable. We, the now vulnerable, wondered how our equal rights to active citizenship had been relegated to an afterthought by hopefully well-meaning people. For us, Freedom Day marked our indefinite imprisonment for the crime of our clinical status. We became the modern-day lepers. The people who wanted to stay well were the isolated outcasts, not the people who risked our health. There was a fundamental imbalance. Freedom for some meant loss of freedom for others. Civil liberties had become a seesaw. Meanwhile, emerging data on long COVID, including more recent data, shows the scale of the problem. In Scotland, the number roughly equates to the population of Aberdeen. And the sectors most impacted include healthcare, social care and education. Repeat infection due to failure to mitigate exposure risk causes multifaceted long-term damage, and it makes long COVID more likely. Herd immunity is not a thing. Conversely, to combat exposure risk, there's now powerful evidence of the benefits of clean air, not just fresh air, but air filtration to remove viruses and other nasties. And those bring obvious preventative health benefits. Yet action on this is painfully slow here and has even explicitly rejected in some contexts. So while the predominant narrative is that the pandemic is over, while hardly anyone wears a mask, and those that do risk hostility, many people are still shielding. Unpaid carers are paying a heavy price for a collapsing social care system, and over 2 million people in the UK of all ages and former health statuses have had their lives destroyed by long COVID. Yet people seem unaware of the ongoing risk to themselves and others, and the tools we now have to mitigate those risks are not being used. So for me, the key learning is that we need to focus attention not just before global shocks and not during them, but on the aftermath of immediate crises. Because until we understand why we're not, there seems little hope that civil liberties will be equally restored or of preventing long-term damage to people's lives, along with the economy, the education and the NHS. So, rather than judging a society on how it treats its most vulnerable, perhaps we should be judging a society on how many people it makes vulnerable when it has the wealth and the tools not to. We can do much to level the freedom lockdown seesaw. A safe, inclusive new normal that maximises everyone's freedom is now so much more possible. And surely that is where we now need to be focusing attention. So why aren't we? I'd like to know, and I look forward to your answers. Thank you very much.
Two very good questions to start with. Peter, let me start with you. Do you think that the use of protest, and you've made the very interesting point that the inquiry appears to be showing that it is a protest that was rooted in Canada and not imported from elsewhere. Do you think it's time limited? Do you think it will fade? Or is it part of a new political movement?
I don't think it will go away. And I think it will provide, as I tried to argue at the end of my overlong contribution, it will continue, I think, to be used by populist politics as a way to attack mainstream liberal governance, in even mainstream liberal democracy, in the name of the people. But I also think that to try and understand this phenomenon as being kind of external to the real body politic is actually embracing the politics of populism. In fact, we need to have a conversation with people making these arguments in order not to provide opportunities for people to use this protest as defense of civil liberties in the context of public health measures opportunistically. I hope that's clear. I hope I didn't come out as a proponent of populist politics. It's not my aim. I'm just saying that the pandemic has provided an interesting frame through which to see how populist politics operates.
Good. What do you think?
I think the question might be a little bit outside of my scope of my research. Yeah, I mean, I think personally it's been interesting to see that. So I'm American, not Canadian. Good to hear that we didn't import anything to Canada.
Export.
And it's interesting because I, live here in Scotland. I've lived here for a number of years now, but my family is in Georgia, which is a state in the South, which tends to be more conservative, although Georgia's been an interesting case recently. And, I have very good friends from the Washington, D.C. area because I lived there for a long time. And, throughout the kind of time that we've been in, I've been to those different locations. As an American citizen, I always have a right to return. And I think each location handled the pandemic very differently, even within the same kind of country. Even people who kind of had similar views on the challenges of the pandemic. And so I think it came back to me about your point of it being both kind of a local as well as a statewide and a global challenge. And that to me, some of these movements, bring it back to trying to understand people's concerns. And it isn't just mostly, this is kind of the view. The pandemic is the view or the vantage point through which people are expressing their concerns, but they're expressing kind of broader narratives for their specific domains.
It's a question of dividing up those narratives. I mean, there is a legitimate position to be held by people who say, I do not wish to be inoculated. And that's a legitimate position. You can disagree with it, you can debate it, but it's a legitimate position. The position you take is, I do not wish to be inoculated because I have an absolute right to say whatever happens to me and to my body in this society, and nobody can interfere with that right, takes you a little bit towards the populist movement. But then what you read out to us then goes all the way towards that movement, which says we are defending the rights of every citizen against the state and the tyranny of the state. And I think it's trying to segment those three things to understand the legitimacy of protest and reservation, right through to the fact that this is a populist movement, whether it's being used by anybody or not. It is a populist movement that has emerged. But let me go on to the second, the issue of the rights of some people. Sally, you touched on the rights of individuals, more than touched on the rights of some people, which were threatening the rights of other people. Do you want to just expand on that a little bit and give us a particular example of where you think that is? You mentioned the wearing of masks, and whether you think it will be a continuing problem, because Adam Tompkins in his contribution, was pretty clear that there were absolute rights, which applied to everybody and could not be interfered with. What we're saying, what you were saying, might don't contradict that, at least question it.
Well, no, I agree with Adam Tompkins. There are absolute rights. My question is why ours are being denied to us. There is a tyranny indeed, and we are currently experiencing. It's a tyranny whereby our freedom could be given us. The risk could be mitigated. Everybody's risk could be mitigated, but it's not being done. And much as we're not necessarily being overtly contained, the risk is of such a nature. It's dressed up as our choice, no doubt, that we choose not to go up. We're told that we just need a bit more confidence. We just need to build our support networks. Well, no, because anybody who reads the clinical research, as I do, who reads the articles in the Lancet and the BMJ and looks at the World Health Network's material, knows that the risk is very real, as do the people who once were healthy, who these days have had their lives destroyed and who nobody seems to be taking any notice of, and whose predicament is not being advertised. So it's almost as if the people who are shouting loudest about civil liberties and freedoms care nothing at all for ours. So there's a bit of an inconsistency there, perhaps, in their argument. And I think that requires to be considered and explored. Why is it okay, if you really do believe in freedom, that you're not going to enable it for everybody? Indeed, of course, our rights, we do not count. I've often thought that the biggest struggle for disabled people when it comes to human rights was, first of all, we had to get acceptance of our equal humanity. And that, at the moment, is not where we are. And so much flows from that. We were not necessarily ill. I was not ill. A lot of us weren't. We were working in full-time jobs. We had very full and active lives. And those have been taken away from us for no fault of our own. So you tell me about tyranny, and that's what my response will be.
Oh, yes, please. We're going to take some contributions from the room now, please.
I found the presentations very illuminating and lots of new ideas. I thought the point about the barbarism of what's happened particularly during the most extreme version of the imposition of the regulatory environment is very well put. I suppose the problem about it was there was no means for people to push back in any form or other. There is no civil liberties organisation in Scotland. All the human rights organisations have much bigger briefs, and they're also, at least in part, not well, the two key ones are partly appointed by the UK government or the Scottish government. There is no independent civil liberties organisations. I made submissions upon behalf of an emanation of Extinction Rebellion saying to the committee, saying we'd like to know how to have a demonstration, we have socially distant or whatever. No response whatsoever. I mean, there were demonstrations, but they were all involved people committing criminal offences. There was no attempt to do that. I mean, there were suggestions made, like to have a virtual square where people would have protests with politicians undertaking to attend virtually or something like that, so that people could come along and say what they wanted to say. It's almost an invitation for populist activity to get going, because the people who wanted to fit in, but to make a new point, couldn't. There was no means of doing that. I think that's a really big gap, and I think we should learn from that we really do need debate. One could speculate that lives would have been saved in care homes if a debate had got going quicker about people saying, what's going on here is completely wrong, but there was nowhere to go. So I think for me, that's a really strong lesson that our civil society is lacking. And that does involve people putting their hands in their pockets, paying for an independent civil liberties organization. We can't expect government to be a conscience, which is what happens at the moment.
So I think that's an important lesson to learn, and I think that's very useful. Are there other contributions that people would want to make? Yes, please.
I'm also from Canada. I just live in Northern Ontario, and my question kind of revolves around.
Could you speak up a little?
The conservative movement there, it seemed a bit opportunistic, but also hypocritical. And this idea of maybe using Western alienation to their advantage with the Freedom Convoy, because as you said, there is a bit of extremist elements within it. But the hypocrisy I noticed is especially right now in Ontario, there's the provincial debate with teachers going on strike and Doug Ford using the notwithstanding clause. But then when you go back to the Freedom Convoy, they wrap themselves in the banner of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it kind of just seems hypocritical in the sense, and also the idea of like Doug Ford not going in the front of the inquiry this week or not at all. So I just see your perspective on it.
Right, thank you. Please.
I've got two questions. Can I ask both?
Of course.
So with my first one, it's about just general government responses to the pandemic. This comes from the fact that in the past 20 or so years, there's been a defunding in humanities in favor for STEM, right? We've been, as people from my generation, been pushed to think about STEM more than humanities. Why would you want to learn about how to improve society when you could make money, right? My question, the first question I'm asking is whether if we had a more developed humanities, social science department, more people to think about how we live our lives in government, would the response to the pandemic be a lot more kind to the country's population? Because as we know with hindsight, it was more kind of like chickens running around without their heads, right? It was just like lock everything down, don't let anyone out. My second question comes from, it might be a bit dystopian to a certain extent. This is something I talk about with my peers who are around my age. So people in their 20s, young 20s, late teens, our lives were basically literally stopped. Whilst older generations, you all lived your lives, you had kids, you had jobs, you had your careers. So for you, when everything opened up, you just went back to work. But we literally were just stopped in our paths. And instead of going into our first careers or finishing uni, we watched the world just stop. We saw this hyper-capitalistic machine literally stop, and we witnessed the world kind of heal. And now we are kind of faced with this dilemma in a sense, like, why should we contribute to this hyper-capitalistic society when we could live in a world that is healing, and we witness CO2 emissions go down and animals go back to their natural habitats. And we wonder, like, why can't we have this? Why do we have to contribute to a society that doesn't let us be free? So those are my two questions.
Those are profound thoughts. Right, Peter, I'm going to ask you to address both of those. I'm going to come to you, Catherine. So,
well, thank you. I agree that the Conservative Party was very optimistic, but it's a choice faced by, I suppose, center-right, right politics across the world, the extent to which to try and incorporate the far right in order to improve their electoral fortunes and gain momentum. And governments everywhere across Europe, especially, are having to come to terms with it. So the Republican Party being in some ways hijacked by the far right in the United States. In the United Kingdom, we saw the Brexit Party really be able to flex its muscles in UK politics. And if I was a young person today, I mean, I have teenage children, and I am just unremittingly furious at the extent to which young people have been screwed by the older generation. You know, who are drawing the baby boomers. I'm not a baby boomer, but I'm pretty close. I mean, retiring early, drawing on fat pensions and multiple properties, while young people have no chance whatsoever. And then voting for Brexit to remove freedom of movement and economic opportunity. And I mean, you know, at some point, young people are going to have to get pissed off, you know, because and actually exercise their political clout. Because if they don't, this will continue to happen. And I couldn't agree more with what you were saying. There was another part to your question that I don't think I've addressed about Canada, but I'd come back to it.
There was also a question about defunding of humanities as opposed to STEM.
I mean, I'm in the history department in the School of Humanities at the University of Glasgow, so I'm hardly an objective voice. But I think in general, you're probably right. I think that we see with Elon Musk, you know, people from a science background, technocratic background, can be really genius at some things, but it doesn't make them good at managing people or dealing with people or doing politics. And I'm a big fan of investing in humanities education and social science education in general.
So I want to address the question on Canada, but I'll address the excellent questions. So on STEM and humanities, so I should have actually mentioned that my research was funded through something called the COVID Collective, which was British government funding for social science research on the responses to COVID and the pandemic. And it highlighted, you know, not only the work that I've done, but things about, you know, how will peace processes exist post-pandemic? How will we monitor peace agreements? How was inclusion impacted in peace negotiations when it came to COVID in spaces like Yemen? And how will this impact societal kind of transformation going forward? There was a range of other projects within the COVID Collective. And so, you know, I can see what you're talking about in terms of a trend of pushing people to STEM, but I can also see, I think, perhaps an increasing understanding of the importance around how we understand our world, thinking deeply about our philosophies and all of this that seeks to inform how we craft policies, but also technological ventures. So for instance, before the pandemic, I attended a conference where a woman who had worked for a big tech company as a humanities scholar talked about how she was integral in the design of AI and how the tech company was seeking more people with her expertise to help inform these systems. And so I wouldn't, maybe I'd take a somewhat more hopeful approach about, you know, there's certainly being trends, but I also think that people haven't given up on the importance of the humanities just yet. In terms of, you know, young people, I guess what the pandemic has highlighted for me in research as well as on a personal front is, and it's been highlighted here tonight, you know, we have folks who are concerned about the importance of protest around climate, around the experience of young people, around the experience of disabled people or people with kind of long-term conditions. We have, you know, spoken about the issues with political movements that have pushed back against restrictions. And so I think for every person you talk to in the pandemic, you get a different idea of the challenges they faced. I was, you know, very lucky to have had a career going into the pandemic, and actually, you know, the University of Edinburgh had additional money from the Scottish Funding Council that wasn't used during the pandemic, that was used to create 37 new Chancellor's Fellowships. So my trajectory in academia has been influenced in a very positive way because of the pandemic. And I got a permanent position that I wouldn't have had if it weren't for the pandemic. And so I feel very lucky in that regard. I think other people are, still building their families, or still building their lives, or still building their support structures. And one of the things I faced was having to rebuild a lot of that coming out of the pandemic. And so I guess to me, maybe this is my diplomatic background, but it seems like it is about understanding all of the challenges all of us have faced in trying to move forward, and trying to kind of ground ourselves in communities. And that to me has been really helpful. But of course, listening to everyone here tonight, have tried to understand so many of the profound challenges and sadnesses that people have faced too.
Can I just say one thing about humanities, and that is, I have always found, and this may not make me popular with the powers that be at the University of Glasgow, but I've always found that British education is far too narrow, far too early on. And in many North American universities, it's actually mandatory to take a course, if you're in the humanities, in sciences, and vice versa. It's a requirement. And I am just for producing more rounded, I suppose, better educated people when they leave universities. And I think that's one way we could do it. To take a course. It sounds completely alien, I think, to most people in this room. Why not take a course in sciences in your first year at the University of Glasgow? Why not have that opportunity? It's a way of creating a more well-rounded graduating class.
And that was the I mean, although my qualifications are in literature and history, I did a course in meteorology at the university in my first year. So, and it was a possibility of so doing. I know we're coming towards the conclusion of this evening. I just wanted to make 2 points myself before I'm going to ask Sally to say a word or two in a second. One was on the question of young people. I'm with Peter in this. I think there is a generational imbalance, and there is a generational guilt which should be expressed properly. But also, we don't know the effect of the pandemic as yet. One of the strongest views I have, in terms of these events and other events, is we're just scraping the surface of that, and there are long-term issues to be addressed, and many of them do lie with young people. But equally, we will have to find a way for young people to be able to move forward despite those disadvantages. But I want to make a wider point, which is about the non-judgmental nature of discussing these issues. I think sometimes we are all experts at hindsight, and we've heard some of that this evening, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's a way in which we reflect on what has taken place. If we look at the decisions that were being made in the first weeks of the pandemic, they weren't, in my view, having been close to the involvement, driven by panic. They were driven by concern, and it's a different thing. Concern. It's about a concern that unless the actions were taken, then more and more people would die. And unable to know how large that would be at the beginning of the pandemic, when we go back and look at it, look in detail, research that in detail, we know that the predictions were of a mortality that in the end was much greater than it turned out to be. So non-judgmental means also accepting that the views, the actions, the decisions changed as the process went forward. That is also true. Jean Freeman wasn't able to be here tonight, but Jean would reflect very strongly on the issue of care homes. There was a political pressure and a medical pressure to get people out of hospital beds because of what was taking place and growing exponentially. And that was widely supported. The science of that was not adequately known until thereafter. And that is no comfort to anybody. But it happens to be true. And therefore we need to reflect that, and we need to record that, and we need to be accurate in our views on it. But I think this has been a much wider ranging and much more, yes, of course. Last contribution.
I have no expertise in any of this, and what I'm going to say may be totally superficial or irrelevant, but I remember back at the beginning of the pandemic, It hit in Germany and hit in Britain at roughly the same time. Germany locked down immediately, Britain delayed for 5 weeks, and for a long, long period after that, we had double the deaths that were happening in Germany. And if this, what I might call a benign tyranny, had been imposed 5 weeks earlier, a great many British people or people in Britain would have been alive. And that to me carries a lot more weight than the, I don't know, maybe they're wrong to say the niceties.
Yes, I mean, I think that one of the key issues that the public inquiry will look at, but also something that we should reflect on as far as we can more judgmentally, is the decisions about lockdown and the early decisions about lockdown. Because I certainly remember the first briefing I attended, which was taken by the chief medical officer, who put the fear of God into us, and that was 4 weeks before lockdown actually took place. But of course, there are issues about how these decisions were made and how they were coordinated that also need to be looked at. Sally, I'm going to ask you to be very brief at the end. I'm not sure we've addressed in any sense the questions you put to us, but I think it's important you have put them to us in a very different session, the session perhaps we're about to take place. Sally, please, the last word is yours before I draw it together.
Thank you. No, I don't think you have answered my questions, but thank you for listening to them. You'd think that a global pandemic of all things would demonstrate how interconnected we all are. And it's somewhat ironic that it seems to have had quite the opposite effect. It's kind of, ripped us asunder. And I think what we're seeing, I would agree, this is not actually all about COVID. What's happening here is symptomatic of some much wider underlying forces across the globe. It is about a different kind of politics. It is about an agenda that isn't around democratic, accountable government. And I think there are different ways of rolling back the frontiers of the state. And I think that's what we're seeing. My concern is that we are ending up in a situation where democratically accountable government has less legitimacy and less authority to take action to prevent its citizens than maybe it did before. And that's of serious concern to me, because I have a pretty good idea who is going to end up paying the price for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Can I draw this to conclusion by thanking you, by thanking Catherine, by thanking Peter for taking part in this. This was the 4th of 6 events. The 5th will be in Glasgow, I think, probably in the same building on the 5th of December. And it will focus on how can we make our economy more resilient, lessons from the pandemic. And amongst contributors will be Anton Muscatelli, Richard Davis, and you and Graham Roy. And we will draw the series together in a final session, which we hope will be approximately a week after that, though it may be a final date is still to be set. Thank you for attending. Some people have attended all of them, some people have attended only one of them. I'm grateful for your attendance. We've had a good attendance online too. Particularly grateful to everybody who's participated. Thank you very much. And thank you. Thanks to all of you.